Hi, my name is Anwar. I'm a designer, a developer, and a teacher at Treehouse. In this course, we'll cover a vital part of the UX design process that can be easily overlooked: designing with accessibility in mind. Accessible design is a design process that specifically considers the needs of people with disabilities. Having empathy for your users means remembering that not everyone uses the web in the same way. Some users rely on assistive technology to help them access the web. Common examples include screen readers, or software that reads web content aloud to assist visually impaired users.
What a screen reader does is, for example, I'm going to start to read this page.
Navigation bottom. Link, University of California, San Francisco. Link, about UCSF. Link, search UCSF.
And what I will now do is slow down the speech rate.
Rating percent, 75%, 70%, 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%. Link, UCSF Medical Center.
So as I was about to say, a screen reader converts what's on a computer screen into information that can be displayed through synthetic speech or Braille output. And it does that by allowing you to use a computer instead of a mouse, a computer keyboard instead of a mouse.
Screen magnifiers, used to enlarge content for users with sight impairments. Switch controls, which allow users with motor impairments to control your site without the use of a touchscreen, mouse, or keyboard.
All right, starting from my left to right, I have buttons. And I'm going to use my tongue, and now you just all got to handle it. Button number 1. It's called move back, move previous. Okay? Middle button, or second button. Select. All right? Third button. Move next.
And closed captioning, used to make videos accessible to deaf and hard of hearing users, as well as users with auditory processing disorder, which refers to challenges not with hearing, but how the brain understands speech. I've included an article in the teacher's notes on this subject.
We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
Making your content accessible to all users is not just the right thing to do, it's required by law. In America, Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act has been applied to digital content like websites and apps as places of public accommodation. In other words, creating inaccessible online content is like designing a new building without wheelchair ramps. It's considered discriminatory against people with disabilities and could leave your product subject to a costly lawsuit. Unfortunately, accessibility is often given a lower priority than other steps in the design process, or even forgotten. To avoid this, let's dispel some of the myths surrounding accessible design. Starting with the idea that accessibility benefits only those with a permanent physical or cognitive disability. Microsoft is one company with a firm commitment to accessibility. I'm looking at Inclusive 101, a manual downloaded from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit. The PDF illustrates various types of disabilities, including reasons a user might only be able to operate their mobile device with one hand. Some of your audience might have a permanent disability, such as having only one arm. However, Microsoft notes there are also temporary disabilities, such as a broken arm that will eventually heal, and situational disabilities, like using a smartphone one-handed while holding a baby. These temporary and situational disabilities can impact your entire audience, not just those with permanent conditions impacting their ability to see, hear, move, think, or communicate. Accessible design makes things better for users with all types of disabilities, whether permanent, temporary, or situational. But is that the only benefit? Actually, eliminating barriers between your audience and your product results in better overall usability, which sounds like a good part of your job description as a user experience designer. The notion that accessibility has benefits beyond allowing people with disabilities to use your product is termed the curb cut effect. While cuts in elevated sidewalks were originally developed to benefit wheelchair users, they also make life easier for pedestrians pushing strollers or bicycles, wheeling luggage, using crutches, or even distracted by a mobile device. Similarly, while video captions are critical for deaf users, other viewers might use them while in a noisy room, to understand difficult vocabulary, or to help them focus and retain information. If you say to yourself, you know what, my product isn't really usable until everyone can use it, you'll never omit accessibility concerns from the design process. But that's not all. Accessible design is good for business since it expands audience reach to include users of varying capabilities. According to the 2011 World Report on Disability, over 1 billion people in the world, or about 15% of the Earth's population, have some form of disability. Excluding them just doesn't make sense from a business perspective. And websites that are coded to accessibility standards have greater prominence on search engines, making your product easier to find. One final myth is that accessibility stands in the way of the creation of innovative products. In truth, innovation is frequently driven by people with disabilities. The first typewriters appeared in early 19th century Italy as a letter writing tool for the blind. Vint Cerf, a deaf American computer scientist frustrated with communicating over the telephone, co-invented the communication protocol that makes the internet possible in 1973. Even universally popular features in today's mobile apps, such as auto-completion and voice control, were initially developed to assist users with physical impairments. So if we're going to make better products by making more accessible products, we'll need a set of rules to guide us. We'll take a look at an internationally recognized set of guidelines. In 2016, a blind man named Guillermo Robles sued Domino's Pizza after he was unable to use a screen reader to place an order through either Domino's website or mobile app. A lower court ruled against Domino's for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act, and disability advocates won an important victory in 2019 when the United States Supreme Court let the ruling stand. But Domino's Pizza isn't the first to be subject to a lawsuit due to online content that wasn't accessible to users with disabilities. There's also Beyonce.com, Amazon, Nike, Target, Netflix and Hulu, Harvard University, Fox News, Burger King, CVS Pharmacy, Winn-Dixie Supermarkets, Rolex watches, Blue Apron, the list goes on and on. And accessibility laws don't just affect websites and apps. A company called Redbox was successfully sued in 2014 because its DVD rental and return kiosks were not accessible to blind users. The legal specifics of web accessibility might vary a bit depending on what country you live in. But in terms of measuring your work against an internationally recognized standard, the guidelines you'll refer to most are the WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. WCAG is broken up into 4 principles. You can use the acronym POUR to remember them. Accessible web content must be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Within these 4 principles are 13 accessibility guidelines. This includes new success criteria added to version 2.1 of the WCAG documentation in June 2018 relating primarily to mobile accessibility. The official WCAG documentation is pretty dense, though fortunately there's plenty of supplementary resources online to help us understand the guidelines. For example, I've included in the teacher's notes a resource called 13 Days of Accessibility, which introduces each guideline in a simpler, more visual fashion. Each WCAG success criteria listing is marked as level A, level AA, or level AAA, which describes how difficult designers and developers should expect compliance to be. On the modern web, level A compliance, such as making sure color isn't the only visual means of conveying information, should be easily within reach. Level AA requires more effort, but this should be the minimum accessibility standard for online content. Level AA color contrast compliance, for example, means a text-to-background color contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 for text sizes below 18 points. I'm using a resource called the WebAIM Color Contrast Checker to illustrate the difference. On a pure white background, a medium blue, such as hashtag 0077cc, will meet the AA standard. But it takes a significantly darker blue to achieve the 7 to 1 AAA contrast ratio. Note that for larger text, such as a heading, the contrast ratio is less restrictive, 3 to 1 to meet the AA standard, and 4.5 to 1 to meet the AAA standard. Level AAA is described as the gold standard level of accessibility. Meeting AAA guidelines will create the best possible experience for all users. However, some AAA criteria, like providing sign language interpretation for all pre-recorded audio content, require specialized and sometimes expensive resources. The WCAG documentation actually doesn't mandate level AAA compliance because it is not always possible to satisfy all level AAA success criteria. My recommendation? Treat level AA WCAG compliance as an absolute must-have. If your product doesn't meet this level of accessibility, your work is unfinished. As for level AAA, apply these standards whenever it's within your means and abilities to do so. In our upcoming videos, we'll take a closer look at the 4 WCAG principles of accessibility. Starting with the letter P. The WCAG principle called perceivable states that information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. This principle is all about providing alternative methods of understanding your web content. If users can't see your content, for example, let them hear it. This principle is broken into 4 guidelines. The first guideline states that the development team should ensure all non-text content has a text alternative. As a designer, you likely won't be tasked with providing text alternatives to non-text elements, which most often means providing alt descriptions so users of screen readers can understand web images. But understanding this Level A guideline means you'll be able to advocate for its importance when communicating with your development team and spot issues during an accessibility review. I'm checking out Mozilla's recommendation on effective alternative descriptions. Note that one-word descriptions like pancakes are not as useful as brief descriptions full of details like stack of blueberry pancakes with powdered sugar. Don't stuff your description full of search engine keywords. And there's no need to include the phrase image of, since screen readers will announce this is an image. The second guideline, time-based media, is about providing captions and transcripts to make audio and video content accessible to people who are deaf or have hearing loss, as well as users with auditory processing disorder. Level A specifies that all pre-recorded audio and video must have captions, such as the ones Treehouse makes available for our video content. I've provided a number of links and resources in the teacher's notes for adding subtitles and closed captions to time-based media. Users can toggle captions on any Treehouse video by pressing the CC button in the lower right-hand corner. A few details we've considered in presenting our own captions include sufficient color contrast, a black background with white or yellow text, and no more than 2 lines of text at once is the recommended format for captions. Also, our captions are draggable. Sometimes captions cover an important bit of code or documentation on screen, so it's helpful to let users reposition them. Finally, each Treehouse teacher is also responsible for reviewing their captions for accuracy. No automatic captioning service provides 100% accuracy, so this review is vital to ensure the captions and transcripts include correct information and match up with on-screen actions and speech. If you spot an error in our captions, don't hesitate to let us know in the questions section. To meet the level AA standard, captions must be provided for live audio and video. An external transcription service such as Rev.com could be used to help make live audio and video accessible to viewers who are deaf or have hearing loss, as well as users with auditory processing disorder. The third guideline, adaptable, states that content should be able to be presented in different ways. For example, a simpler layout, without losing information or structure. While this guideline mostly pertains to developers using semantic HTML meaningfully, mobile designers need to make sure content can be understood and navigated in both portrait and landscape orientation. Here are 2 screens from an athletic performance app called Garmin Connect. A user unable to rotate their device from landscape to portrait mode would have trouble using the step details screen, while the walking screen does a good job of reorienting content. The fourth guideline, distinguishable, describes making foreground content distinguishable against its background. We covered accessible color contrast in our previous video. In addition, it's critical that designers combine multiple visual cues to convey information rather than relying only on color. It's been estimated that 6% of males struggle to distinguish red from green. Fields containing errors can be impossible to identify for users with red-green color blindness when a web form uses only red and green highlights as indicators. The addition of error messaging and iconography makes the form accessible for colorblind users by making them aware there is an issue that needs to be corrected. The distinguishable criteria has one very important recommendation that pertains to both audio and videos that contain sound. Avoid using auto start as much as possible. Audio that starts automatically interferes with screen reader performance. Also, any sound 3 seconds or longer should come with a mechanism for pausing the sound or lowering the volume. As for the visual presentation of text, the AAA requirements offer pretty solid design recommendations for responsive body copy. Keep your text a maximum of 80 characters per line. Don't justify body copy, and provide sufficient line height, at least 1.5 times the text size within paragraphs, and at least 2.25 times the text size to create space separating paragraphs. AA requirements under distinguishable called resize text and reflow also have to do with responsive body copy. Your user shouldn't have to scroll horizontally to read your text or struggle to use your navigation, even when zoomed in at 200%. I'm looking at an article by the Bureau of Internet Accessibility, which recommends zooming in on a web layout to 200% and checking to see if the content is still legible without horizontal scrolling and that the navigation remains functional. I'm testing this out by pressing Command+ to zoom in. And sure enough, the text still reads well at 200%. The navigation no longer fits, but it looks like it switches to a mobile version featuring a drop-down menu. You've probably noticed that many of these criteria involve coordination between the design and development team. But then, accessibility should never be just one person's responsibility. Everyone on your project team should be aware of accessibility needs to ensure those needs are considered at every stage, no matter what the end product. Coming up, we'll take a look at the letter O in poor, making our web content disabilities operable. Must be able to operate your web content. The operable principle is all about removing barriers between your user and your content. Many users rely solely on a keyboard to navigate the web, either due to a temporary or situational disability, or a permanent disability related to vision or motor skills. The first operable criteria requires testing that all interactive elements are accessible using the Tab key. Keyboard users need to be able to exit each interface element as well, avoiding what's known as a keyboard trap. In this example, I can use the Tab key to select the next interface element, or Shift-Tab to return to the previous one. A blue focus indicator shows me which element is currently selected. However, once I enter the form input labeled last 4 digits of your tax ID, I'm stuck, unable to move forwards or backwards. That's a keyboard trap and is extremely frustrating for keyboard-only users. Providing keyboard shortcuts is a great way to help your keyboard-only audience, as long as you make the shortcuts easy to learn and the documentation easy to find. I'm reviewing a document called Mac Accessibility Shortcuts, with a list of shortcuts for activating common accessibility features such as the voice-over screen reader, as well as instructions on using your keyboard like a mouse to navigate and interact with items on screen. Designers should ensure focus indicators, which highlight the currently selected element, are visually obvious. The indicators must remain visible and obvious no matter what element is selected, whether main menus or sub-navigations, form fields or drop-down menus. Trying to navigate a site that lacks focus indicators using a keyboard is like operating a mouse with no visible cursor. You'd never know what you're clicking. It's worth noting that designing accessible interfaces often requires combining a number of WCAG criteria. For example, here's a screen capture of the Mac OS Accessibility Options menu in both light and dark modes. However, in dark mode, the contrast ratio between the focus indicator and the background doesn't come close to the minimum standard. Keyboard-only users are forced to either guess which option is selected or switch to light mode. The second guideline of the operable principle, enough time, states that when completing a task, such as booking a flight, has a time limit, users should be able to adjust or disable the time limit if they need extra time. WCAG makes an exception for when the time limit is an essential part of how the content is experienced. For example, if an eBay auction has lasted a week and is set to expire in an hour, that's essential to how eBay works. But if a user wins an auction and needs extra time to fill out a form full of purchasing details, the WCAG requires eBay to make extending or disabling the time limit easy for users. Users should also have the option to disable distracting content. For some Slack users, a message like this one with an animated GIF might make concentration difficult. Fortunately, the Slack app allows users to disable animated GIFs and emojis. Under the main Slack menu, I'll choose Preferences, then click the Accessibility menu. Slack gives me options to increase font size and to adjust keyboard navigation features. And here's the option to block animated images and emojis. Now I can see the image is no longer moving. I've included a link to an article on Slack's accessibility features in the teacher's notes. The third operable guideline is called Seizures and Physical Reactions, and states that animations should never flash more than 3 times in any 1-second period. To learn more about providing safe visuals, I've included a link in the teacher's notes to an article by the Epilepsy Foundation called Photosensitivity and Seizures. The fourth guideline, Navigable, states that users should be able to navigate, find content, and determine where they are. Designers should understand the importance of using descriptive, easily identifiable headings to organize content. For example, I'm looking at an article from Smashing Magazine called I Used the Web for a Day Using a Screen Reader. As a visual reader, I can scan my eye over the content headings, such as What is a screen reader? And How to enable and use your screen reader, followed by subheadings like VoiceOver on desktop and VoiceOver on mobile. This lets me quickly decide whether the content below the heading is relevant. Screen readers function in a similar way. Users can navigate using headings and skip to a desired heading to begin reading at that point. The navigable guideline also specifies that the purpose of a link should be clear from the link text alone. Here are two different links to the same content. However, in the first example, the clickable text reads, "Click here," which gives no clue to what the user will find after clicking the link. This is poor SEO practice, as search engines value descriptive text links. But this could also frustrate users of screen readers who are able to tab directly to hyperlinks without reading the full sentence. In the second example, the sentence has the same meaning, but the clickable text reads "basketball videos." Now the user knows what to expect. The final operable guideline is called Input Modalities and covers interaction beyond the keyboard. I'm looking at a resource called the Touch Gesture Reference Guide. The movements diagrammed here are familiar to many users of touchscreen devices. Because users of assistive technologies might not be capable of such complex interactions, the Input Modalities Guideline suggests making alternative navigation available that can be activated by a simple tap, click, or physical gesture. In addition, the Input Modalities Guideline states that interface elements should be a minimum of 44 square pixels in size. You'll notice this is a AAA guideline, but I think it's a pretty critical one. As illustrated by Apple's UI design do's and don'ts, buttons that are too small or placed too close together are difficult to accurately tap with a finger. Unfortunately, Apple didn't follow its own recommendations when creating the Mac OS interface. The red, yellow, and green circles in the upper left corner of each application window to close, minimize, and maximize are only about 16 pixels in size. Tests have shown that users with disabilities relating to motor skills have struggled to click these buttons with a mouse. The WCAG recommendation for more generous target sizes would have made Mac OS Windows more accessible. So keep those guidelines handy to ensure the interfaces you design can be operated by users with disabilities. Up next, we'll examine the letter U in POUR. Making our web content with disabilities must be able to understand your content and use your interfaces. The understandable principle is broken into 3 guidelines, beginning with one called Readable. The Level A requirement is pretty simple. Developers should set an appropriate language attribute so screen readers know what language to expect and what accent to use in pronouncing page content. In the example shown here, the document's primary language is English, but this particular paragraph asks the screen reader to switch to French pronunciation. The Readable guideline also covers plain language. The website plainlanguage.gov, a resource for keeping body copy clear and straightforward on federal government websites, recommends using strong, simple words, short paragraphs, clearly organized information, and a conversational tone. I'm looking at a sample of complex versus plain language. The lengthy single paragraph on the left creates an intimidating wall of words that few would enjoy reading. And check out this sentence. The fungal material is carried into the respiratory tract when airborne particles are inhaled. I'm guessing listening to me read that was pretty tedious. The presentation on the right delivers the same information, but in clear language. Be careful. Watch out for mold in all these materials after a flood. Simplifying language like this helps users with cognitive disabilities, low reading literacy, and those encountering an unfamiliar topic or language. The second guideline, predictable, has to do with keeping app and website experiences predictable and navigation schemes consistent, something which benefits all users regardless of physical ability. In addition, the predictable guideline warns against unexpected changes in context. To avoid disorienting users, the following should happen only when the user initiates a change by interacting with an interface element. Opening a new window, loading a new page, significantly rearranging page content, or moving focus to a new component. As the Mozilla Developers Network says on the subject, people don't want interfaces to surprise them. They want things to be intuitive and behave as expected. The final understandable guideline is called input assistance. Users sometimes make mistakes, no matter how well designed the web form or interface. Prevent frustration by making errors easy to spot and correct. A Nielsen-Norman Group article linked in the teacher's notes offers 3 principles for error reporting in forms. The error message should be easy to notice and understand. The fields in error should be easy to locate, and users shouldn't have to memorize the instructions for fixing the error. We'll take a closer look at designing an accessible form in the second stage of this course. You might have noticed that the understandable principle was quite a bit shorter than either the perceivable or operable principle. Our final principle, robust, is the shortest entry of all in the WCAG. We'll take a closer look. The final WCAG principle, robust, states that content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. But what does that really mean? The robust guideline asks developers to write valid HTML and use correct semantic markup. Since this course is aimed at designers, we're not going to cover how to write valid semantic HTML, although I've included an article on the topic in the teacher's notes. But should you find yourself conducting an accessibility audit of an existing website, it's helpful to know a few resources to assess markup validity. An HTML validator, such as html5.validator.nu, will look for errors in HTML elements, such as missing closing tags or quotation marks, or even misused semantic elements. I'll paste the URL of the WCAG 2.1 guidelines into the validator, and good news, it's valid HTML. I'll also try validating one of my local files, in which I've included a few mistakes. And we can see the line number and description of each error. Google Lighthouse is built into Chrome's DevTools and runs several audits on a web page, including accessibility, loading speed, and search engine optimization for either the desktop or mobile view. I've loaded the current desktop version of the Domino's Pizza website, and I'll right-click and choose Inspect, then find the Audits tab. I'll make sure I've selected Desktop and press Generate Report. It looks like Domino's Pizza has improved its accessibility score since the lawsuit. Where there are issues, Lighthouse explains the problem and highlights the code that needs improvement. The most recent addition to the robust principle, status messages, pertains to dynamic web apps that use JavaScript to add new content without refreshing the page. If I'm looking at a social media feed that uses JavaScript to display new posts without a browser refresh, screen readers should be alerted to the existence of the updated content. Let's watch a demo of NVDA, a screen reader for Windows machines, reacting to a warning message appearing dynamically beside a web form.
Status message example. Heading level 1 status message heading level 2 product review. We appreciated your product review and value your opinions. However, comments with inappropriate language will be removed. Blank. Comments left 300 characters or less right co. Edit multi-line enter product comments. S. Warning. You will be logged out in 5 minutes if there is no further activity. Select add more time if needed.
You can see that the warning message was initially not present on the page and was added dynamically once the user began typing. That is a status message. You made it. We've covered every principle in version 2.1 of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now that we've reviewed the guidelines, in the final video of this stage, we'll learn to work accessibility considerations into our quite a bit about accessibility requirements. But how do we incorporate this knowledge into our design process? The first tool we'll be examining is one we created here at Treehouse. Linked in the teacher's notes of this video is a document called the Accessibility Checklist for UX Designers. This 4-page PDF visualizes the WCAG guidelines that matter most to designers. The PDF is interactive, so you can toggle checkboxes on screen as accessibility concerns are met on your next project, or print out a copy to share with your team, or keep by your computer. However, following WCAG guidelines doesn't by itself guarantee an accessible experience for your user. It's critical to involve users of varying capabilities in the research, persona, and testing phases of the design process. If you're not sure how users with disabilities interact with the web, ask them. Include people with disabilities in your discovery phase, during research, and while sending out user surveys. I've included articles in the teacher's notes with tips on including people with disabilities in your user research, as well as a resource from SurveyMonkey on creating accessible WCAG-compliant surveys. The results of your research should manifest in more inclusive user personas. Personas are all about increasing empathy and reminding your design team about other perspectives different than their own. Imagine you're tasked with creating an app that allows users to book reservations and join waitlists at their favorite restaurants. If your personas contain a blind user, you're less likely to make the mistake Domino's Pizza made of creating an app that can't be accessed by a screen reader. If another user needs a wheelchair or scooter, you'll remember to provide filters to allow users to narrow search results to restaurants with accessible tables and restrooms. Involving users with disabilities in user testing is equally critical. Doing so will likely require additional time and resources, such as conducting tests using an assistive device or with a sign language interpreter present. But the rewards outweigh the cost. Not only will you learn how to make your product accessible, but the lessons learned from removing barriers will make your entire team more conscious of accessibility issues on future projects from day one. Early in this stage, I listed a number of companies who have been subject to lawsuits for getting accessibility wrong. So I'll conclude with a resource from a company with an ongoing commitment to accessibility. In the accessibility section of Apple's website, we see a thorough guide to iOS accessibility features, including voice and switch control, as well as a remarkable short film edited by Sadie Paulson, an editor, director, and cinematographer with cerebral palsy.
People think that having a disability is a barrier. But that's not the way I see it. You can catch up with friends.
Ready?
You can capture a moment with your family.
One face, small face, focus lock.
And you can start the day bright and early. You can take a trip to somewhere new.
3 miles to the summit.
You can concentrate on every word of a story.
A bird began to sing. Jack opened his eyes.
You can take the long way home. Or edit a film like this one. When technology is designed for everyone, it lets anyone do what they love, including me.
Forms are notoriously difficult to use for even the most capable users. Online shopping carts, for example, have an abandonment rate of almost 70%, according to Baymard Institute. While many users are merely browsing and not ready to buy, Baymard found that over 40% of abandonments are due to problems with checkout form usability. In the final stage of this course, we'll be using Figma to build a mock-up of an accessible form. We'll cover form design accessibility principles and take a look at resources to guide us. And by the end of this stage, you'll be better prepared to communicate accessibility concerns to your development team as you reach the designer-developer handoff. Before we open Figma, let's examine the components of an accessible form. One critical principle when you're in the planning stage is to avoid asking unnecessary questions. Many users object to providing a phone number unless it's extremely obvious why the form recipient might need it. But requiring a phone number can be a particular burden for deaf or nonverbal users who, depending on the availability of video relay services, might be unable to make or receive calls. If you're a food delivery service and rely on phone calls to clarify orders, that's a legitimate reason to be asking, but provide an alternative method of contact for users who can't answer your call. Questions about gender could also frustrate your audience. If your website or app has an extremely compelling reason to ask about gender, such as trying to gather accurate demographics, check out the teacher's notes for tips on designing inclusive form language. You'll need to either give the user plenty of response options or provide a text input rather than a list of predefined options. Assure your users their information will be private, anonymous, and safe. But again, if the question isn't absolutely essential, don't ask it. Avoiding unnecessary questions will also reduce the number of overall form questions, which brings us to the next principle of accessible form design: minimizing the number of questions that appear on each screen. Limiting the number of tasks presented to the user on each screen has multiple benefits. In addition to faster loading time, a big plus on mobile, it helps screen readers jump straight to the relevant information. Correcting errors will also be easier, since the number of fields facing the user at once will be limited. And simplifying the presentation of information can reduce cognitive load. In other words, the amount of information the user has to process or remember at once. This one task per page approach benefits all users, but especially those with cognitive disabilities or dementia. To further assist such users, make sure your form provides context clues. Chunking, a term used to describe breaking a form into steps, only works if all the following are perfectly clear: the purpose of the form, what step the user is on, how many tasks have been completed, and how many steps still remain. While users with cognitive and memory impairments benefit most from context clues, distracted users who may have received a phone call in the middle of attempting to complete a mobile form will appreciate the reminder as well. Grouping related questions visually further reduces cognitive load. If some questions deal with personal information, some with account information, and some with contact information, and if it's necessary to keep each group on the same screen rather than splitting the form into smaller steps, make an obvious visual distinction between each group. Using clear form labels and not just placeholder text is another important step in guiding users through your form. Placeholder text is sometimes used to clue the user as to what content is expected and how it can be formatted. But placeholder text disappears once the user begins typing, and the user can easily lose track of which field they were filling out. Labels should be placed close to the field they belong to, and on mobile screens, labels should go above the input, not beside it. Speaking of form inputs, one of the guidelines we covered under the operable WCAG principle was making focus indicators obvious. Each browser comes with its own default focus indicator style, but the cues are pretty subtle. Making focus indicators stand out will be a big help to users who can't operate a mouse or touchscreen. Finally, you'll hopefully recall a WCAG guideline called Input Assistance. Don't forget to make form errors easy to spot and correct, and your error messaging easy to understand. If designing an accessible form seems daunting, it definitely can be. But I've included a number of resources in the teacher's notes to guide you, and I recommend referring to them whenever you're faced with designing a form. In our next video, we'll apply these principles to design an accessible form. Let's take a look at the mock-up of the form we'll be building, a mobile food delivery checkout form for a restaurant called Tacos by Roscoe. I'm concentrating on getting just the first screen right for gathering the user's delivery information. I've included an error reporting screen as well. Now, let's take a look at the project files included with this video. I've provided a logo icon to work with, as well as color swatches. Our initial design frame, labeled Delivery Information, is 320 pixels wide. Many modern phones have wider viewports, but I want to make sure my form is legible at the smallest possible screen size. To get started, I'll create a header bar and add my logo. I'll start with an instance of my linear gradient component from the design assets frame. I'm resizing the gradient to 320 pixels by 70 pixels, adding an instance of my taco emoji logo, and typing the name of the restaurant in a Google font called Nunito Black. I'll convert the header into a component just to keep my content organized. And I'll call that logo header. Next, I'll create one of my 3 navigation buttons for my checkout process. It's important to give users context clues to let them know exactly where they are and how many steps remain. Once I've created one button, I'll make it a component, which I'll name Nav Button, and use Command D to duplicate twice more to create 2 more button instances. Now I'll change the color and text of the billing and review buttons. I could leave these buttons white, but I'd like to suggest that they're inactive. Users can't visit these upcoming stages without completing the current stage. I'll choose a gray color for the inactive button while keeping an eye on the contrast ratio. I want to make sure users with low vision can still read the labels of the upcoming steps. I'd like to give users a brief summary of their order. On a desktop screen, I'd have space for a separate column of order details, but on mobile, a brief summary will do until users reach the review order screen. People don't like filling out credit card details without knowing exactly how much they'll be charged. To create the fork and knife icon, I'll head over to fontawesome.com and choose Copy Unicode Glyph on an icon called Utensils. Font Awesome Free is already available for use in Figma, so I just need to paste in the glyph using the solid version of that typeface. You might notice that as I've been making components, such as my newest component labeled Order Summary, that I've been rearranging them so that they appear from top to bottom in my Layers panel to reflect their order in my design frame. This is completely optional, but I find it helps me locate design components quicker later as I add more and more layers to my document. I'd like to make the form heading, Delivery Information, pretty obvious, as well as distinguished between required and optional fields. This is something you'll want to test on users. Are they clear which fields are optional and mandatory? Now I'm ready to create some form inputs. I'll make them at least 44 pixels high to respect the target size guideline. I'm choosing my form labels carefully to try to be as clear as possible about what information is needed in each blank. By choosing your name and email address, over just plain name and email, I'm aiming for clarity, not concision. Users with cognitive disabilities might struggle with a shorter label. Some form fields may need more than just a label. Even if users understand what belongs in the input labeled email address, they may still wonder why an email address is required. I'm creating an explanatory note. Receipt will be sent to this address. I'm making the text a little lighter, so let me double check. My background against my foreground still receives higher than 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. Before I move on, I'll add an additional rectangle to the name field, which I'll call focus indicator. I'm using a 3-pixel stroke rather than a single pixel, and a blue color that doesn't appear elsewhere in my design. If the user were to tab to the next field, this blue border would shift to indicate the email address input is now selected. I'm creating blanks for street address, which will be required, and apartment or office number, which won't. You'll notice I'm placing labels above the form inputs, as there isn't room to place them side by side on a mobile screen. I'm also not using placeholder text. It's tempting to save space by using placeholder text instead of form labels, but then it's up to the user to remember the purpose of the input once they begin typing and the placeholder disappears. Placeholder text also creates a tricky color contrast problem. Make the text too light, and users with low vision can't read it. Make it too dark, and users might confuse the placeholder with a pre-filled form input. I'm assuming this particular food delivery service is limited to the United States. So I'll reduce the number of form inputs by providing instructions indicating that the user's city and state can be looked up based on the user's zip code. I've included an article on the benefits of this technique in the teacher's notes. I'm not requiring a phone number for reasons covered in the previous video. I'm also not using placeholder text here because I'm not requiring the phone number to be formatted in a particular way. If you need to require a particular format, you could use placeholder text to suggest the desired formatting, but many users struggle to recall that format once they begin typing. A better solution is a technique called input masks. I've included an article from Baymard Institute in the teacher's notes to learn more about converting the user's text to the proper format as they type. To allow the user to include delivery instructions, I'll create a taller text area input. And finally, I'll duplicate and detach an instance of my linear gradient asset to create a submit button with rounded corners. I'll label this button carefully, labeling it Continue to Billing should make it clear what step the user will see next upon submit, provided they haven't made any errors. Since all users do make errors from time to time, we'll need to provide clear instructions on how to fix them. We'll create error messaging in the next video. A Nielsen Norman Group article I mentioned previously that gave us 3 principles for error reporting. Error messages must be easy to notice and understand, highlighted visually, and accompanied by clear instructions for fixing the problem. With those principles in mind, I'm going to duplicate the frame I created and call my new frame Error Reporting. I'll mock up 2 types of common errors: a user making an invalid entry and leaving a required field blank. Using the text tool, I'll create sample information for a user named Maria Hernandez. Here's her email address, and I've omitted the @ symbol, making the address invalid. I'll also create a street address, but no zip code, which means a required field is empty. I'll start by making the error fields red, since many users associate red with stop and green with go. However, I know that's not enough. I haven't told users how to fix the errors, and I haven't provided additional visual cues to help colorblind users who might not notice the red highlights. Font Awesome offers an icon called exclamation triangle that looks like an error warning, so I'll add that to the labels above my problem inputs. I'll use the space below the inputs to explain each error. With the email address, I'm trying to be as specific as possible. Something like invalid email address would offer no clues as to why the address was rejected. So I'll try email address must contain a single @ symbol. And please enter a zip code. Should explain the error on the empty required field. I've included resources in the teacher's notes on form error messaging. It's not an easy thing to get right, and you'll definitely want to user test your proposed solutions. If you have time, go ahead and complete the designs for the billing information and review order screens. I'd love to see what you come up with. And as you build your portfolio and position yourself to enter the industry, be sure to refer back often to the resources we've covered here. Designing with accessibility in mind isn't always easy, but designers who put in the extra effort to make sure their product is available to users with disabilities will always be in demand.